Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast.
On the show today, we welcome Hermann Simon, inductee into the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame and author of multiple books, including Confessions of a Pricing Man. We discuss numerous topics, including why out of all the 4 Ps is pricing constantly neglected. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast, a place for business leaders to get the best and most credible information on marketing, strategy, and innovation. Your hosts, Marc Binkley and Vasilis Douros, share their experiences as they gather insights from the world's leading experts. Now, on with the show.
Welcome to the show today. We have Hermann Simon. Hermann, both V and I are super excited to talk to you. I'll give a bit of an intro, but you're the world's leading pricing authority on pricing, which is, from our perspective, amazing to have you here. So super grateful to have you. You're the founder and chairman of Simon Kucher and Partners, which is the world's leading pricing advisor with offices in 27 countries. And you just mentioned you've now gone over 2,000 employees, which is amazing. So congrats.
That's incredible.
You've been inducted into the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame, which is amazing. Author of multiple books and articles, including the one I've got here, Confessions of a Pricing Man, visiting professor at Harvard, Stanford, Tokyo Business School, INSEAD, pretty much anywhere where people are learning at the highest levels, you've kind of been. So welcome to the show. Thank you.
Hi, Marc and Vasilis. I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, this is going to be great. And we're going to be, the general theme is around pricing, obviously, but also managing for profit, I would say, is kind of a subtext to this. And V and I, being both in marketing, we hear about the 4 Ps all the time, and we talk about the 4 Ps a lot. So price, product, place, promotion. And for some reason, I would say that pricing seems to be one of the least talked about of the Ps that I've in my entire career. I honestly, other than saying, let's put a discount on something, I don't know that I've ever had serious conversations about pricing. Is that common in your world, or do you see that happen a lot?
That's absolutely true. Good observation. Price is the neglected stepchild of the 4 Ps. I did a test once in the Harvard bookstore and looked on the bookshelves. There was a full shelf of books on advertising, and there were 3 books on pricing. Of course, pricing is a boring and fear-inducing issue for managers. So managers, business journalists, professors rather try to avoid it. They speak about product design, promotion, advertising, distribution. These are all interesting topics, but pricing seems boring. And that's why I choose it, because very often the boring things are the ones with the biggest business potential and the least competition.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's 8. I've got probably on my shelf alone too. So many books about advertising, promotion, and all that. And you're right. One now on my bookshelf for pricing. Yeah. Is there, just to kind of jump to some of the takeaways, I guess, to begin with, or maybe observations from your perspective, is there common mistakes that you just see over and over again that people have with pricing?
The most frequent mistake is, of course, cost plus pricing. That they use costs as the base to price their products. And I actually call this differently, namely Marxist pricing. Why Marxist pricing? The most famous theory of Karl Marx is the so-called labor value theory, where he says that the value of products is determined by the input of labor, and labor is costs. All costs are ultimately labor costs. It's of course nonsense. If you build a new steam locomotive with a lot of labor in it, nobody will buy it. So the value is not determined by the cost, by the input of labor. The value is determined in the eyes of the beholder. The customer determines the value, and from the value, the willingness to pay originates. And that's indeed a very interesting old wisdom. The old Romans 2,000 years ago had in their Latin language the same word for value and price, namely pretium, like in precious. So this is the fundamental equation of pricing. Price has to equal value, has to equal pretium. And so avoid Marxist pricing, call it Marxist pricing, because then it's more easily abundant, because nobody takes Karl Marx seriously today.
That's a fair point. There's, I don't know if you've heard about this saying, but there's something that, we use here in, I guess, Western culture, where if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right? And, because Mark and I both worked in retail, you almost felt that, that the highest incidence of price wars really happens in that discipline. And, it was a way of boosting sales. So immediately you're putting a price action on a certain category and you're trying to drive volume. Now, the motivation really appears that you're trying to hit revenue targets versus profit. Why do you believe that's problematic?
Yeah, because it's the wrong goal. The only meaningful goal is profit, to be profit-oriented. And the reason is very simple. Profit is the only goal which observes both sides of the coin, the market side and the cost side. All other objectives like revenue, volume, market share, beating the competition are one-sided, because they only observe either the market side or only the cost side if you do cost plus pricing. And of course, in retail, managers are driven by a volume and revenue obsession. One guy of one of the largest retail companies in Germany told me, we had a discount according to the value-added tax, which is 19%. And we had 40% more customers, more traffic. If you do the calculation, look at the gross margin, they would have needed 200% more traffic in order to compensate for the reduction in the margin. So they think in the wrong terms. The only acceptable and meaningful goal is to be profit-oriented. Right. Of course, not in the short term, but in the long term. In an early stage of the life cycle, you may accept losses even for years, like Amazon did, or Salesforce.com did, and eventually become profitable. But profit is the only meaningful goal of a company. And the reason is very simple. As Peter Drucker defines that, profit is the cost of survival. Profit is the cost of survival.
That's incredible, because, another example came to mind right now for me. And so one of my personal recent experiences was in the airline industry here in Canada. And between the two major carriers here, I've never seen a price war like that ever before. You'd have one airline put a pricing action into market, and immediately the other airline would counter, maybe even go deeper and whatnot. And marketing communications would literally happen within the day. Like, it is very reactive. And I'm curious to hear your point of view on why do we start seeing that aggressive price matching war, I guess, if you will, not only in aviation, but retail as well. And why are they so prone to that?
In the airline industry, that's especially frequent and typical. And the reason, similar in retail and many other industries, behind this is overcapacity and the strive to get the capacity utilization up. And the consequence is that the airline industry has not made a profit in the more than 100 years of existence. If you add up the profits and losses,
Yeah.
it's practically zero over 100 years. That does not necessarily apply to each individual airline.
Right.
For instance, Southwest Airlines has been more profitable than the average airline, but on the average, it applies. And if we look at the general situation with regard to price wars, we every year do a global pricing study, and in the recent one, 59% of the companies, of more than 3,000 companies in the world, which we surveyed, said that they are in a price war. And what is also interesting, 88% blamed the competition for initiating the price war. It's always the other guy. The record holder, by the way, was Japan, where 84% of companies say they are in a price war. So that's probably the same as in the airline industry. And price wars are the most effective profit killers.
One thing just popped in my mind is within your book, you showed there's different profitability averages for countries, basically for the industries that or the companies that you're looking at. I think Japan was one of the lower ones, if I'm not mistaken.
Japan in this statistic is actually the lowest one. And that is due, as in the airline industry, that price wars are rampant there.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I wonder, in your experience, is there, I'm just going to ask it. Is there a better way to react to discounts then from a competitor? Instead of just looking at it and say, I need to at minimum match it, or I need to be as aggressive? Because I think what happens is like the game gets played, and all of a sudden, if at the end of the day, organizations drive value through profitability, well, these pricing actions can't work in their favor. So what are other ways potentially that organizations should be looking at, and combating those competitor discounts?
It's very difficult. If you are in a price war, to end a price war, if you have overcapacities, reducing the overcapacities is very difficult, because you can only do it if the competition somehow follows, comes along, etc.
Right.
One way is, of course, to reposition yourself to avoid the head-on collision, to reduce the competitive intensity, the cross price elasticity. And I think that is a long-term, more promising path to go higher on the scale, to put yourself into a better cost position, to build your brand.
Right.
If you look at a brand like Apple, they have pricing power. They even could increase their price by 10% under the inflationary condition without losing many customers.
Right.
Whereas if Samsung or Huawei do that, they would lose, if they increase their price by 10%, they would probably lose 30% of their customers.
Yeah.
So it's a long-term strategic positioning challenge to avoid this head-on, purely price-oriented competition.
Yeah, that's incredible. It is. Again, it's quite fascinating, and I think you're right in the context that the moment that you hit, you go into that action of pricing war, then it is inevitably a race to the bottom unless something circumstantially changes, in that industry.
Yeah.
And you talk about capacity, and capacity is interesting because, again, my mind goes to the airline space, because like they're flying so many airplanes, so there's already inundated so much capacity in the market, and because the need to fill those planes is so high, they're willing potentially to operate flights at a loss just to make sure that the planes aren't grounded, or they maintain that capacity in the market. So it's quite interesting to hear that.
Yeah. Another very important point in this context is that the marginal costs are low. I mean, if you fly an empty seat or if the seat is used, the cost difference is minimal.
Yeah.
So, and the marginal cost defines the lower price limit. If you get a price which is just above the marginal cost, it means that you earn a contribution margin to your fixed cost. But ultimately, you cannot live from contribution margins. You must live from fixed cost. That is also a big problem in the internet and digital business, because there's the marginal costs are actually zero. So prices can be extremely low, but that is not sufficient to survive because you have to make a profit. You have to cover your fixed costs. But the marginal cost issue for airlines, for hotels, where you have a fixed capacity, is really a danger, you could say, for pricing, because it allows you to go very deep in your prices. And this does not contribute enough contribution margin to cover the fixed costs.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible.
Hermann, during V and I were doing some research, and during a few of the presentations that we watched of yours, you were talking about sort of this cost profit formula. And one of the presentations you had talked about profit equals price times volume minus cost. And I really want to kind of just dig into that a little bit, because it on the surface seems like very simple, but it's actually pretty profound when you kind of break it down. And I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's indeed very simple in principle. Profit equals price times sales volume minus cost. So you have only three profit drivers. One problem is that they are interdependent because price influences the volume, and volume actually is likely to influence cost. If you have bigger volumes, your unit costs are lower. So the interdependencies are very complex. But let's come back to the basic formula. And the question there is, which of the three profit driver is the most effective one? And a very simple consideration, let's assume that we can improve each profit driver by 1%. What happens to profit? If we can increase price by 1% without losing volume, which is very realistic. We are doing it in our consulting business all the time. For instance, you can reduce discounts by 1%. You may not lose any customer. So you increase price by 1%, then for a typical industrial or service cost structure, profit increases by 10%. In theory, we would call that the profit elasticity of price. I call it simply the profit multiplier of price.
Okay.
10% over 1%, so the profit multiplier of price is 10. For costs, it's 6 if you can improve, meaning decrease cost by 1%, your profit usually increases by 6%. So the profit multiplier of cost is 6. And for volume, it's only 4. Why? Yeah, because for a typical setting, we have the phenomenon of marginal costs. So if you increase volume by 1% without suffering on the price side, no impact on the cost, your revenue will go up by 1%, but 60% of this are eaten up by the marginal cost. So to summarize, price is the most effective profit driver, with a profit multiplier of 10. The profit multiplier of cost is 6, and for volume, it's 4. So it's clear what you should do. And coming back to the argument of Vasilis, if you cut your price by 1%, it's the same is true. So if you instead of improving, you weaken your situation with regard to price, it's also 10 with a minus. For cost, it's a minus 6. For volume, it's a minus 4. Because with decreasing volume, the marginal costs also go down. So it
So
works on both
so,
sides.
so
Price is the most. It means, for instance, you should rather accept a volume decrease than a price decrease.
yeah, which is kind of counter to what a lot of
That's incredible. Yeah.
it's almost yeah, it's counter to what a lot of typical reactions are, because and maybe it's because we're driven by,
That's
say,
true.
market
Yeah.
share instead of profit. Because to maintain market share or expand market share, you want to grab more customers, and so in doing so, often that's the price lever that they discount to gain the volume. But then you're almost negating the benefit, because if price is a profitability driver of 10 and then cost is 6 and volume is 4, like price is equal to the combination of those two
Yeah,
other ones.
yeah. And that applies even to good companies. A executive vice president, the guy in charge of global sales and marketing of BMW, and that's certainly a good company, said to me, when do I get in trouble? I get in trouble when we lose 1% market share.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get in trouble if profit goes down 20%, because then there's always an excuse. It's a dollar exchange rate or the business
Right.
cycle or whatever. So I said, he said, when we have a board meeting, I get in trouble when we lose market share or sell fewer cars, not when profit goes down. And that shows that even in good companies, there is kind of wrong orientation. And you have to correct that. Half of the companies we survey say, if we are honest, we are volume oriented. Volkswagen, for instance, for years, they had the goal to overtake Toyota in the number of cars they sell. And they actually achieved that in 2018, 2019. And their profit margin was half that of Toyota. Toyota made about 8%, Volkswagen about 4%, and their market capitalization was also half of Toyota, though they sold more cars than Toyota. So you see there that this is the wrong orientation. To only look after market share or volume, you have to find a balance. And we did in hundreds of our workshops, I could say, a test where we asked, you are in a tough situation. Would you rather accept a decline in volume of 6% or decline of 5% or decline in price of 5%? And 80% of the managers say we would rather accept a 5% decline in price than in volume, which confirms, Marc, just what you said.
Yeah, like you're sitting here talking to us about profitability, and V and I also recently had to read this book called The Goal, and the premise of that book is that the goal of all businesses is to make a profit, which is put,
that is this book, which was also True
Yeah.
Profit. That is the book about profit, not only from the pricing aspect, but even from ethical aspects, from comparison across countries, and of course from the profit driver perspective.
And like I'm sitting here listening to you nodding, thinking 100%, that makes total sense. Profit is the goal. And then you like leave here, and I'm going to go into some kind of conversation, I'm sure, with businesses, and it'll just default to common perception that revenue or market share is the driver. Is that a thing? Like, is it just like and shareholder value and maximizing shareholder value, top line revenue? Like, it just seems like they're totally opposing ideas. I mean, they're related, but they're opposing.
No, they are not opposing. So the problem is in the daily life of a manager. Of course, a manager is concerned if he or she loses volume, if the market share is declining. They may not have enough work for their employees. They may have to lay off people. These are all unpleasant things. But
Yeah.
it's essentially going in the same direction. When I say profit is the cost of survival, you have to earn profit like another kind of cost and not hope at the end of the year that something is turning out as profit. So I think profit orientation, building a strong market position, shareholder value orientation are not contradictions, but go into the same direction. A very important aspect there is the long-term orientation. I don't speak for short-term profit maximization,
Mhm.
but clearly for a long-term orientation. And if you adopt this view, your real challenge is not to defend or increase revenue this month or this quarter, but to make sure that the company works profitably over the next years of your tenure as manager or CEO. And this is a very different attitude from filling the next flight between Toronto and New York. Of course, you have to fight with this day-to-day problem. But if you fill the flight at low prices, which lead to loss, you are not doing anything for the survival of the company, the longer term survival. And I think the core of the problem is there in this longer term orientation, reconciling that with the daily pressures you experience as a manager. And I also distinguish between good and bad market share. It's a very important point. What is good market share? Good market share is earned and acquired by innovation, by good quality, by satisfying your customers. Bad market share is acquired by price actions, by discounting, etc., without having the necessary cost base. If you have a very low cost base, like Aldi, a hard discounter Aldi, you can afford, or Southwest Airlines compared to the classical airlines, or Ryanair in Europe, you can afford to have lower prices because your cost base is lower. But if you don't have this cost base and you sell on low prices and discounts in action, you will fail in the long term.
I know we have a list of questions, but I'm like, my head is just spinning because there's so many interesting things that you just mentioned. Go ahead, B.
Yeah, what's interesting is like, I was just going to say, you think about new entrants, say into, I don't know, let's pick on airline again, right? So there's new entrants coming in, and immediately what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to not match on price, is really undercut the competition. So that's their reducing their barrier to entry is, I'm going to just make sure that I'm offering 20% less than all the fares that are in the market, in hopes of building, well, affinity to their product, but also volume, right? However, that can only last, I'm assuming, for very long, because not every airline can kind of come in and say, hey, I can sit for an entire year and I'm just going to undercut the competition by 20%, and I'm just trying to build a loyal base. When, in fact, at some point, though, there's a time continuum that stops them in their ability to stay so competitive, and hence why, I forget what the stat was, it's almost like 70% of new entrants in the airline industry go bankrupt within the first couple of years or something ridiculous. I'll have to go back and find that. It's insane.
Yeah.
But when I think about the volume and the marketing aspect is like trying to build loyalty, because then if you have a loyal customer, then they may be willing to pay a lower price. Your comment then to say, well, there's good market share and bad market share. If the product or the quality isn't equal, the moment that airline has to ask for more, then the customer may not be willing to be like, to pay that. It's like, you're not on par with what I would expect. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's an interesting story under many, many aspects. First, you say all these ambitious guys go bankrupt, 70% go bankrupt and leave the market within, say, 5 years or so. Yeah, of
Yeah.
course. The other point is, how do you build loyalty as an airline? They all use the same product, Boeing or Airbus.
Yeah.
They have to go through the same chaos at airports, etc.
Yeah.
How do you want to build loyalty under these circumstances?
Yeah.
That's a difference to hotels. Hotels have their own infrastructure. There's also some standardization. A good friend of mine is Horst Schulze, the best hotelier in the world. He created Ritz-Carlton, which is considered the best chain of hotels in the world. And there you have more parameters by which you can differentiate yourself. So it's ultimately people. And Horst Schulze told me when I asked him, when he thinks of a doorman, he said, we employ the lowest paid people and our guests are the richest people, billionaires, etc. How do I reconcile? He said, I start with the language. I tell the guy who was unemployed before he joined, I put him in a nice uniform, and then I say, it's when somebody shows up, you don't say hi or hello, you say, welcome, madam, welcome, sir. And when you have delivered a service and the guest thanks you, you don't say, okay, you say, my pleasure, sir, my pleasure, madam.
Right.
So what I mean by this is that the opportunities to differentiate yourself as an airline are very, very limited, or they are costly. You can build sumptuous lounges, etc., but that costs a hell of a lot of money, which is unaffordable for new entrants. And then I come back to the root of this problem. Why does it happen? Because people love planes and airlines. I always have wanted to become a jet pilot when I was a young guy, but I failed due to color eye problems. Investors, people, I know people who own airlines who never make money on it, but they own an airline, who can afford it from other business and support it. I think that is the reason why airlines have been running for 100 years without making money. It's a hobby of people.
Yeah, I think Richard Branson was famous in saying that if you want to be a millionaire, be a billionaire and invest in an airline.
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah. I have one friend who built a huge hospital chain, sold it, and now he is invested in several other businesses, and one of them is a small airline. And he doesn't make money on that, but he owns an airline.
That's fair.
One of the things that in the book that I was reading, you've talked about sort of pricing and where does it live. And V and I have had conversations about brand and where does it live. And so I just kind of wanted to chat about that, because if pricing is the biggest profit driver, the biggest lever for driving profit, I should say. I've had very few conversations until recently about price in my career. Like, where should it live? Like, I think, if we take the 4 Ps, promotion lives in marketing, product probably lives in product development, or could be in operations. Operations probably takes care of place. But where does price live inside of an organization?
We increasingly have pricing managers, and the special problem with pricing is, again, that it has to observe both the market side and the cost side. So the promotion advertising manager observes the market side, but is not much concerned about cost. The production manager, supply chain guy, they are mostly on the cost side, and pricing has to reunify both sides. So the pricing manager is typically rather high on the level. And then you have a second dimension, you could say, who has price decision authority? In most cases, the ultimate price decision authority is high in the hierarchy, but you need latitude, says for sales reps, etc. So you have a hierarchy of price decision authorities, because in business to business, all prices are negotiated. Of all transactions in the world, about 75% of the price are negotiated and are no fixed prices. What we experience as consumers in a drugstore or a supermarket, where you do not negotiate prices. And so from the organizational point of view, it's quite challenging and complex to get the pricing organization right.
Yeah. I used to be in, and one of the things I want to chat about too is different.
And
Yeah.
one more point, Mark. When we ask companies, when we come in the first meeting as consultants, who decides on prices, they usually don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Because so many people are involved. And it very often it's not well organized.
Yeah. In terms of pricing models, one of the examples I wanted to ask you about was in B2B. I used to be in sales before I went to the dark side and joined marketing. And that was an interesting element, because you would have my colleagues that were selling product like broadcast media and they would negotiate prices, and there were some people that would always undercut the prices that I was getting. So even though we're the same company, we're supposed to be going out with the same product. One rep might offer a particular discount commonly, another one might maintain the price level. And so even within the company, there's variability there, which was frustrating and challenging at the same time as it was like interesting to learn from.
Yeah. I distinguish two kinds of salespeople. One category are value sellers, and the other are price sellers. In some of our projects, we have recommended to replace price sellers by value sellers. And that usually, if it's implemented, brings the profit margin up by 2 percentage points or so. Simply the basic attitude of the salesperson.
So the focus more on the value as opposed to right. Yeah.
Value selling, of course.
Interesting. So
that's especially important under the inflationary conditions we have now, because again, simply passing through your costs is illusionary. You have to understand how the willingness to pay changes. And of course, if you can increase the value, do better, more effective value communication, people are willing to pay more and not to switch to cheaper products under these very, very difficult conditions right now. And that makes life very difficult for salespeople. Under the stable price years we had over the last 30 years an average price increase in inflation rate of 2% or less. You went once to your customers and asked for a modest price increase. Now you have to go 5 or 8 times per year as the sales rep and say we have to increase our prices. And that makes life much, much tougher for the sales guys. And I expect and see that already an increasing number of resignations from sales, because it's getting so tough.
It is a mindset too. I mean, thinking back to my days in sales, like we had 2 teams. There was a team that sold a cheaper version of a product, and there was an expensive, and we would go in and team sell. But the one team is just selling based on price, and the other team's selling on trying to communicate value, which was such a dichotomy to have in the same room. And you got one guy going, well, you can get X number of spots on air for like super cheap. And the other one going, we've got a great audience. We've got great value. We've got great creative, all these other things. And it was kind of interesting.
We had an interesting case, which kind of reflects this culture. In a chemical company, they introduced what we call a less expensive alternative with reduced service, longer delivery times, etc. So about 20% cheaper. And the company made one mistake. They let the same sales force sell the two alternatives. This did not work. The classical guy who were used to offer customized solutions, value selling, they could not sell the cheap product. So it only became successful with the less expensive alternative after we separated the two sales forces. These are two different sales cultures. Like a premium store is different from a discount store. In everything, in the design, in the layout, in the turnover of the assortment, in the people they employ, everything has to be different.
And so thinking
adjusted.
back to the part of the conversation where we're talking about where does pricing live, and you're talking about the pricing manager or director overseeing this, I imagine there's a role. The role extends beyond just setting price, but into also communicating internally, at least the pricing, and probably training would be a part of that as well. You know, if you're trying to sell value, you need to,
of course,
show people how to sell value.
Yeah.
But then it also, I'd imagine, extends to product too, in that the way the product is built and designed, as you just described, you can have a cheaper version or a more expensive version. And if it costs more, then that has to trickle down to the product development team as well.
Of course, that's all right what you say. And that leads us to, we could say, the core of pricing. As a price consultant, I have been asked thousands of times, what is the most important aspect of price? And my answer is always the same. It's value to customer. So as price consultants, we actually have to be experts for value to customer, understanding, quantifying, defining the value to customer. And that translates into the company creating value. So you could say that's innovation, product related, communicating value, that's branding, advertising, delivering value in the distribution channel, in the service which accompanies the product. So it relates to all aspects which contribute to value. And that is the whole process and the whole value chain. And you have to understand how much each component, design or whatever it is, brand, contributes to value, because that is the only way to get the price right. And going back to the old Roman Latin thing, value equals pretium equals price. That is the balance.
Yeah, and so you just mentioned it there, but just to, if I understand right, you did talk about something. The line, I think, was good pricing is 3 prerequisites: create value, quantify value, and then communicate value. And so now there's a lot of stuff that V and I were just chatting about, marketing's role in improving price elasticities. And so I think part of what you're saying is like it's an integrated team effort to communicate and define the price and understand the customer's willingness to pay and provide and show that value.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at what you give to your customer, there are many components which I named already, like the product, the technical features, the design, the packaging, the brand, the promotions, the influencers. And then you have to understand how much they contribute to the perceived value of the customer, and then you can set your price accordingly. And very often there are quite surprising results. For instance, a case from Porsche, when they introduced the Porsche Cayman, that is a hard top, usually, and the predecessor was the Boxster, was a convertible. Usually hard tops are 10% cheaper than the convertibles. We did a big study in various countries, Europe, US, Dubai, etc. and came with our recommendation to make the hardtop 10% more expensive. And at that time, Porsche had a very courageous CEO who said, we go for this. And actually, they sold even more than we predicted in our model. So this means not following traditional industry practices, but really understanding what is the customer willing to pay. And that is derived from the customer's value perception.
That's super interesting.
There's a whole bunch of pricing models that are out there, and I just wanted to kind of chat about some of them because I find, like you talked about this in your book, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember like when In Rainbows came out from Radiohead. They offered it as free, and you just pay what you want. And it was one of the first times I really recognized price as something more than just a discount. And I wasn't quite sure what it was, but it was really interesting. And so there's all kinds of pricing models that are out there. The freemium model is one. There's one that I also found interesting. I was talking to a colleague at work, and they were like, okay, well, what about McDonald's? They bundle products. So you get a Big Mac and a large fry and a Coke. That's a pricing model. But then there's the flip side of that. This is kind of what I want to ask you about. There's like an Epson printer that is kind of like a bundle because you're buying the printer, but then you can buy the ink cartridges. And the ink cartridges are like crazy expensive relative to,
Very expensive.
But you have to buy the system. So it's kind of a bundle, but it's a little bit different. So maybe you can just talk about some of these different models, if you don't mind. Like they're fascinating.
Yeah. Actually, we have had more pricing innovations in the last 30 years than we had in the last 3,000 years. And the reason is mostly technology. Let me just give you one example. Socrates, 2,500 years ago, said, the value of a product is not in the ownership, but in the use, what we call value in use. So why was the sharing model for cars, for scooters, etc., for Airbnb not introduced 2,500 years ago? Because it was technically not possible. It only became possible with the internet. If you sell a scooter for $1,000, it's one transaction. If you sell it by the minutes, it's thousands of transactions, each with a minimal amount.
Right.
And that can only be handled economically through the modern payment and allocation systems. And the same is true for freemium, for pay per use. You need sensors, measurement systems. Like Michelin, the global leader in tires, they introduced a new tire which runs 25% more miles than the old tire for trucks. Now you cannot increase the price for trucking companies. They're very price sensitive, say from $1,000 per tire to $1,250. So they introduced a system where they charge according to the mile driven.
Right.
So the trucking companies pay only if they actually drive, and they could implement a 25% higher price. They have the same for airplane tires, where the number of landing counts. The McDonald's system or the Microsoft Office system, the bundling is a very smart technique, theoretically, where you use unexploited willingness to pay for one product, transfer it to the bundle. So even theoretically, these things are very sophisticated, and the music plays in these new systems, not in just price a little higher or a little lower, but in multi-dimensional systems. Just to show you one case which we invented. This card is the so-called Bahncard 50 rail card issued by the German Railway Corporation. This card costs $500. Why do I buy it? Because it gives me a discount on all tickets of 50% for the duration of 1 year.
Wow.
It means I go from a one-dimensional price system for the tickets alone to a two-dimensional system where I have the price for the rail card and the price for the ticket, but 50%. Just to relate that to inflation, I'm only affected by 50% if prices for rail trips go up. And of this card, 6 million have been sold. And that is a loyalty builder because I pay only 50%. And if I have the choice between going by car or by rail, I prefer the rail in many cases. So this is a game in pricing, away from one-dimensional, say, low-tech pricing to multi-dimensional, complex pricing schemes, pay-per-use, you mentioned freemium, and all the others which are around there. What I do not recommend is pay what you want. The one example, they were successful, but museums, restaurants tried it and usually give it up after a certain time because some people exploit this, take advantage of this situation where they can decide on the price.
Going back to the McDonald's versus Epson one, and as you're talking about these other examples, like it seems to, I mean, there's lots of interesting, innovative opportunities, opportunities for companies to innovate just on pricing models. And when I was thinking back to like some of the stuff you were talking about before with connecting price with product, with promotion, with place, like choosing which path you go, whether it's like the McDonald's, I got a burger, I'm going to add in fries and low margin products as a bundle to increase my transaction value. Or if it's like the Epson model where you're like, it's integrated system and we're going to make money. We're not going to really make tons of money on the printer, but we'll make lots of money on. It really needs to be kind of thought of as a system where all those 4 Ps are connected together, as opposed to just price. Like I'm going to set a price and throw a dart at the board and say that's going to be our new price. Like it is completely, it's a choice to create a product and a system of pricing like that. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You have to think in systems. For instance, if you think of elevators, practically they could give the elevators away for nothing because then they get a service contract for the next 30 or 40 years for the elevator, for the lift. So you have to think multidimensionally. You have to think in system. You have to include the time aspect, because if you sell the machine and then the consumables or the service, that's stretched over time. So it means under inflationary time, the discounts are heavier, which is further into the future, it's less valuable. It's very complex. That is our business. We love complexity.
Sorry, Vivek.
Yeah. No, it's okay. Like the one thing I'd like to offer is just the rise in subscription-based, I guess the pricing model. Like while subscription-based isn't new to the industry, early on you would subscribe to magazines and that was kind of like in its primitive form. But you saw things like retailers and a lot of these other online companies thinking about razors. Like you sign up to the Dollar Shave Club and then you get every month you get a new package. I love your just kind of your take on the subscription style or base model and its ability to drive profits.
Yeah, the subscription model has different aspects. One is, of course, to create customer loyalty. The other is convenience. If you get regular deliveries for products you regularly consume, you don't have to bother about buying them or running out of supplies, etc. So it both offers value and creates loyalty. Subscription for digital products is even more attractive, like Spotify, LinkedIn, etc., because there your marginal costs are zero. You build a long-term customer base. If the customers are satisfied, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to spend money on promotions, etc.
Right.
So instead of selling, say, if I take something like Spotify or Apple Music, of repeatedly selling it every year because you have only an annual subscription, you build a continuous base of cash flows. So again, this is also to a large degree a matter of technology, that you have the
Yeah.
technology available to operate these systems efficiently. And the customers may eventually forget that he
I was just
pays
gonna
every
say,
month a
Mm-hmm.
subscription fee. Yeah. If
yeah,
if he or she is satisfied, I think that is still the challenge to keep the customers loyal.
no, and you bring up a great point, because you think about all the, the streaming services right now that are available to consumers, Netflix,
Yeah.
Spotify, et cetera, et cetera. It may be $7, $5 a month, and in of itself, it doesn't seem like it's expensive. $5 a month, I can afford that. That's not a big deal. But I think there is that
Mhm,
sense
mhm.
where there is, consumers start, because it becomes familiar, then they just start forgetting that, hey, this is a reoccurring charge. And then all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden,
Yeah, yeah,
you've been a
yeah.
Spotify user for the last 2 years, and you've spent, $400
I'm
on it.
not aware of, I haven't read a study on the sum of the monthly subscriptions, but I could well imagine that there are consumers who have a dozen subscriptions
Yeah.
or so, which are adding up to more than
Yeah.
$100. And
Yeah.
so that may become a problem. Another aspect is, of course, Netflix is a good example. You really have to offer
Mm-hmm.
value. Disney
Yeah.
has been more successful in the recent past with the its streaming service, because they have the content, and next Netflix is fighting. So it's not
Yeah.
automatically going. You still have to deliver permanently good
That's a great
customer
point.
satisfaction ultimately.
Yeah, and when it comes to the customer's willingness to pay, that does change over, like your comment about time, because it does change over time. Your what you perceive to be valuable today, let's say Netflix subscription, or pick any or my Amazon subscription, or like your Bond 50 card. Okay, at one point in time, I felt like that was good value, but if all of a sudden they jack up the prices and I kind of reflect on that, it gives me an opportunity to think about, do I use it? Do I not use it? Like, then that changes my perception and my willingness to pay. And so I think, as much as companies, and you mentioned innovation a few times, but there's companies that kind of set and lock in on a way of doing things. And I think it's really, from what you're saying, it's as important to, once you do that, to also then continuously find out what
Right.
customers' willingness to pay is, because it could change because of market conditions or
Absolutely, absolutely. If we compare several cases, I think Amazon with Prime is a very interesting case. I order so much at Amazon, I wouldn't consider getting out of my Prime subscription. For media, if we think of Netflix, it's different, and new competition came in that changes the relative value, the relative willingness to pay, and now they're even thinking of having an advertising supported version where the monthly subscription is only $4.99. Absolutely, it's exposed to the same dynamics as other markets. If you have innovation, if you have new competitors coming in, the willingness to pay, the price elasticities change. Absolutely. So you have to
Yeah.
be keen all the time not to miss a trend of this kind.
I have one more question, if you don't mind. So again, from a marketing perspective, we talk about brand, like I think it is one of the advantages that a lot of companies can have, in that if you can build a brand, there's a perception that we're building a value or perceived value in the customer's mind, and which increases the customer's willingness to pay. I think the subtext of that is, like, you need to be totally differentiated, or a company like Apple, to be able to do that. For does in your experience, do brands, can a regular brand like let's say Netflix versus Disney Plus, they're not that dissimilar, but can anybody compete on price and increase their prices to be better to be a better brand, to be more profitable, or are you just kind of destined to to be whatever you are today? You know what I mean? I don't know if that's clear. That's probably not a great question.
We have two causalities. In 95% of the cases, the causality is from product value to price. But in luxury markets, we have a couple of cases where brands actually increased their price and the sales volume also increased because they were perceived in a different higher luxury category. That happened to bags and to a couple of other products, but that is pretty rare. Usually you have to create value through innovation, through branding, through the right distribution channel, and then you can charge a higher price. And that is, by the way, a long-term repositioning. A good case is Audi, the car brand, especially in Germany. They were not perceived as very attractive 30 years ago. And it took them really 30 years to come on par with BMW and Mercedes. The other way around is easier. A famous case is Lacoste, the sheets, the polo shirts. They were once an exclusive brand, then they decreased the price, and today they are no longer exclusives. They are pretty normal things somewhere in the middle with no exclusive positioning. So the price also affects the perception, the positioning of quality, of prestige, etc.
So my takeaway there is that you can increase your price. Anybody can, but it just takes time to become perceived.
It takes time, and it takes first performance on the value side.
Right.
A good case is also Lexus. Lexus, the premium brand of Toyota, was introduced in the United States in 1989. And it started at a very low price. And since the quality and the service were so good, they built their reputation and they increased the price every year over a period of 10 years. And still sold more cars and came closer to Mercedes and BMW. So this is a case where the value was delivered first and the price followed ensuingly over many years, long term, as you say.
Yeah.
This has been an incredible conversation. There's so many times, even demystifying a lot of the, the pricing models. And I think you've armed us with a lot of great tools to make sure that even internally, as marketers, we don't constantly get picked on. I'd love for you to share with them, how can people find out more about you?
The simplest way is hermannsimon.com, Hermann with one R and two N, or simon-kutscher.com. That is a homepage of our consulting company. And as we said, we have now actually 43 offices in 28 countries, 2,000 people, 2,000 pricing experts. And if I may just share the story, I visited marketing guru Philip Kotler. That was in 1979 at Northwestern University. And I was a professor at that time and told of my pricing research, said I would like to have an impact on practice. He said, every young researcher wants that, but nobody achieves that. And then he said, but I know one guy in Chicago calls himself a pricing consultant. And that was an eye-opener. I said, somebody can make a living from pricing consulting? Then I started the company with my first doctoral student, Dr. Eckhard Kutscher. And today we have 2,000 people.
That's
Last
incredible.
year we crossed 522 million in revenue. So the area seems to be
there's something there.
Rich
So
hunting
you're saying you
ground.
might have a future in this. That's fantastic.
That's incredible.
Yeah, Simon, thank you. Or sorry, Herman, thank you so much for everything. This is just, yeah, like my head is just spinning. There's so much stuff that's in all of this. It's exciting. It's
Yeah,
really
I
exciting.
mean, I describe that in much more detail in such a thick book, 600 pages, Price
Mhm.
Management. But that's really tough reading. Confessions of the
Yeah.
Pricing Man, which you mentioned, is much easier and more for
Mhm.
practitioners. So I enjoyed our discussion.
Thanks again.
Of course.
Time for the post-pod discussion with Marc and V. You know what time it is?
V.
Post-pod. Let's
Post-pod.
go. Let's do this.
So, Herman.
Well, first
What'd
of
you
all,
think?
anytime we have an opportunity to bring on people at the caliber of Herman's, because, you know, what he's inducted into the Hall of Fame for the Thinkers, top Thinker 50 Hall of Fame. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think it's like he's the world's authoritative voice when it comes to all things pricing. Like, I just love the dialogue that we have
Totally.
around price wars. We talked about even like the cost profit formula.
Yeah.
We talked about, you know, things like the 3 profit drivers, if you will. And he kind of, remember he went into the multipliers about
Yeah.
each, like what lever is
Yeah.
the most important lever. You know, it really started, at least in my opinion, it's like how many organizations actually get it wrong because they're myopic in their approach and they're just trying to drive that top line revenue instead of thinking about it more holistically from a profitability perspective. So, you know, there's a few, obviously like a few nuggets that I was able to kind of pick apart, at least from my perspective, to say, hey, this is something I'm going to carry with me now. But it was just so fascinating listening to him as he spoke about pricing. I don't know. It's not you. I remember you talked about like,
I agree.
what was it like? Pricing is or maybe he did, the neglected stepchild of the 4 Ps. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's true
Yeah.
though. It's true.
Totally. I like it. Honestly, there's, other than that conversation we had with Herman, like I don't think there's really been, maybe a handful of times that I've had a meaningful conversation
Yeah.
about price in my career
Yeah.
with colleagues. I mean, you know, we talked a lot about discounts, and that's an automatic sort of approach to pricing that happens, especially in retail,
Yeah.
in your case, in the airlines too. But I mean, as far as like, yeah, a meaningful strategic conversation around pricing, I honestly, like maybe
I'll
3 or
be honest,
4.
I don't think I've ever been in a conversation around pricing or one that I can influence in terms of, you know, hey, as a marketer, it's like, this is the price. Get it out in the market. Let people know. It's never been, hey, let's talk about price
Yeah.
as a group, right?
Yeah.
Because it's always done by a few
Yeah.
individuals in an organization that marketing is usually pretty far removed from.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting too how he was talking later on. We were talking about maximizing shareholder value, shareholder returns, and how that. I think the question I asked him was like, is that at odds with profit maximization? And so his answer was interesting in that it's no, it's not at odds. It's just that there are different timescales. So there's obviously like the pressure of the short-term returns, which forces a hand towards volume, as opposed to long-term returns, which forces a hand towards profit. Yeah, so and a lot of the recurring themes there with other guests we've talked about too, in that short-term versus long-term. And so thinking about pricing as a long-term strategy as opposed to just something that's a quick, I need more volume today, but thinking about it in terms of driving profit and the health of the organization through price is pretty, like, it's when we go back to that pricing formula, like it's a simple thing, but it's so deep if you get into it and start thinking about what
was
the
that one
implications of
example
that
that
are.
he shared with us, the BMW executive who says, I never get I get in trouble when we lose 1% market share. I never get in trouble if profits go down.
Right.
It's like, because they can rationalize it so many different ways as why potentially profits are down. But the perception of market share is much greater. And that's not just for likely that industry. I think everywhere, everyone kind of sees that percent. Ooh, losing market share. Gonna have to think about that. Right. And it's, in actuality, actually has nothing to do with the total, at least from a formula perspective, like how you actually drive profit. Anyways, it's a fascinating conversation, and obviously we probably would have peppered him with even more questions. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think we got through 5 of our questions that we had written down because we just kept going into like different thought processes. But it was the one that wasn't. Sorry, it was the one thing that was interesting. I did want to just quickly. I wanted to highlight something. I said during the interview, like 70% of new incumbents in the airline industry, like they go bankrupt or file for bankruptcy or something to that effect in the first 5 years. I just want to circle back because there may be some listeners that are going to call me on that. So the actual stat is, like, in 2020, there was travel intent that was down by approximately 70% for all airlines. But in 2021, there were not more than 90 new airlines launching. So they're basically citing that there's about 40% lower cost to start an airline. So I misread that stat, but that article goes into detail around why they don't believe it will go, but they didn't actually attest a stat to that. So I just wanted to kind of set the record straight there. I don't want to be called out on
it. I'm going to call you on the next time. Yeah, it's funny. The airline industry, though, is so. I remember I did see somebody, which is
Bartram.
Yeah. Bartram,
Yeah.
I think his name was Bartram. I remember seeing a presentation from him a bunch of years ago, and he showed I think it was actually on 2 slides.
Yeah.
From A to Z, the number of airlines that had started and then died in Canada. It's like a long list. And I think probably by the sounds of it, a lot of it's related. I mean,
it's so complicated.
Business
it's so complicated.
Sure.
I don't want to turn this into an airline conversation, but I think the one thing I appreciated about that industry was just so, not only how competitive it is, but it's how hard it is to actually drive profitability because of the high margins that exist. And so much of it is outside of the airline's control. Working with airport authorities, you're working with so it's one of those things that it's difficult for them to survive. And I think, well, what did Hermann say? It's like, airlines haven't been profitable in the last 100 years on average. Sure, there's the anomalies like the Southwests and some of these other ones, but in the last 100 years, as an average, they haven't been profitable. That tells you a lot about the industry.
That's crazy. Totally. The other one that we didn't get a chance to ask him about, but I used to be in the agency world, and I wish I had a chance to ask him about this. But there's like pricing in terms of when you bill for time, and so I remember back then when I was working in agency, you would create projects based on how many hours you think it's going to take. And this is be true probably for a lot of industries, like, say, engineering or legal fees and things like that. And so you bill for the time. The one tricky part about that is that, let's say you've got a project that's 100 hours and you charge $1 an hour. So you've got a $100 project. The first time you do it, you're like, okay, well, that's a good idea. Let's do that. But then you get better over time. Let's say you do that 10, 15, 20 times. Then unless you increase your hourly rate, you're going to end up discounting your experience. So then rather than, because it might take you less time to do it. So now all of a sudden you're like maybe cutting your time in half because you're getting more efficient, but you're not charging for the benefits of your experience. You know what I mean? So I wish I would have asked him about that. But we did ask him, the one question we did ask him about was, like, there's the Epson printer idea or the Big Mac bundling. That I thought was fascinating because there was also the idea that the product you have lends itself to a pricing strategy, and so you can design
Yeah.
pricing into your
Yeah.
product.
No,
And
that
vice
was
versa.
a great call out, because like it's a different. Well, if you think about it in totality, like the bundling is great for consumers, right? But actually, it's can be really lucrative as well for the organizations behind them as well, right? Because you're probably hiding in there some low margin products with some high margin products, so then that's how you're kind of offsetting to it. So I thought, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that question was bang on. I also love so when we asked
Mm-hmm.
him around how to avoid price wars, and he says it was more of
Mm-hmm.
a positioning exercise that you had to do, and you have to really kind of, to
Mm-hmm.
avoid price wars, you have to avoid that head collision that occurs. So it's, how do you rethink
Mm-hmm.
about your brand? And I love that he brought that up, because as marketers, it's something that
Mm-hmm.
obviously we know how important brand is, but it's like the way you can avoid price wars, another reason why you should be investing in your brand, differentiating yourself in the market. So that differentiation, that repositioning, if you will, is a great way of avoiding those price wars, which is, I think, it's a great
Mm-hmm.
takeaway as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's so fascinating because the context in which you're selling your
Yeah,
product or your services
totally.
makes a huge difference. So if you're saying, "Oh, we're like, Coke is like Pepsi or Pepsi is like Coke," then everyone goes, "Well, how much is that?" And then
Yeah,
you just benchmark off of that. So if you were to say like Coke is like
yeah,
champagne, then all of a sudden you create a new pricing model just based on
totally.
the way that you're positioning the product. It's so
Man,
fascinating.
I'm telling you, this conversation, I'm sure it's not going to be very clickbaity for our listeners and stuff like that, but like there's so many nuggets in here that are so important for us to consider as marketers. Another one that for me, I talked
Mm-hmm.
about it here at the top, just around the idea of like, what's the multiplier effect? So things like, if you increase price by 1%,
Mm-hmm.
the profit increase was a multiplier of 10, right? If you want to
Mm-hmm.
decrease your cost by 1%, that profit multiplier is about 6. And then if you're trying to increase your volume by
Mm-hmm.
1%, then your profit multiplier is only 4. So when you think of all these levers
Mm-hmm.
together, you can make a more strategic decision on what makes sense for your organization, right? But price is always going to be the
Totally.
one that's sitting there at the front, which is important. But I think, again, you have
Mm-hmm.
to use it in the right context. What was the thing he said?
Mm-hmm.
Just scrambling through my notes right now. Might have to circle back to it. All right, it's around like the good market share versus bad market share, where bad market share is constantly being
Right.
acquired by discounting price actions without having the necessary cost space. So that idea of cost space is,
Yeah.
if you actually have that, then yeah, discount away. But when you don't have that, then you
Mm-hmm.
probably shouldn't be pulling that lever too often.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. It made me think, like, I think it was the first thing that we asked him even was, what's one of the common mistakes? And he said cost plus pricing is one of the most common mistakes people make. And it's one of the
Totally,
most common
totally.
kinds of pricing models. So to your point, like, the different profit levers you have, price being 10x and reducing cost being 6, and then increasing volume being 4. I mean, if you don't think about price differently, then yeah, like we're all starting from
Totally.
the back foot. You know what I mean?
I
Like,
think
yeah, it's fast. It's like, it's such an obvious thing. It's funny. I was talking to my wife about, what we got
Yeah.
this guy Hermann on. We're going to talk about price. She's like, what do you mean talk about price?
It's
I'm
a
like, well,
thing.
there's like, it's a thing. And she's like, but don't you just set the price? I'm like,
Totally.
yeah, but how do you set the price? She's like, huh, right, yeah. So it's just one of those things that's, I think, almost invisible to a lot of people because it's just
Yeah.
taken for granted. Um, and cost plus is so common that you just don't think of a lot of different options that are out there. But there's hundreds and hundreds of different combinations
You know
that you
what?
can
Like,
come up with, I'm sure.
to all the marketers out there, being armed with this new information around the multiplier effect of these 3 profit levers, ask your organization, What is the
Mhm.
multiplier effect for your organization for each of those levers? Like,
Mhm.
find out, because I think that will inform
Mhm.
how, as marketers, we react to a softness in the market or trying to generate more demand or whatever the case may be. And it's a very intelligent question. It's simple in how it's being utilized, but it's also a
Mhm.
way of forcing that conversation, because I think pricing probably needs to live. Well, actually, I'm trying to remember, because he did answer that question: where does pricing live? And I remember he brought up another example. He's like, no one could identify the single source where pricing was coming from for any given product and whatnot.
Mhm.
I know our shared experience in retail was a little bit different potentially, because you had buyers that were responsible for
Mhm.
setting the price and whatnot. But
And then, yeah, minimum advertised price and stuff.
exactly. So I
Partners
think that
and
was a little
retailers and
different, but it's still,
suppliers.
it's something that, people, again, where does pricing even live?
Yeah, and from, as you mentioned, from the marketer point of view, I mean, there's a comment that he made about there's 3 requisites for good pricing:
Mm.
create value, quantify
Yeah.
value, and then communicate value. Which I thought was really awesome as well. I mean, there's definitely a
Mhm.
role there for marketing to play, which is around communicating value, but so much more. I think when you think about creating value and quantifying value, that's like an interdepartmental kind of conversation. I think that a lot of marketers could at least lead,
Yeah.
because you want to talk about how
Yeah.
do we communicate this. So then, coming back to the branding thing, like, what is it that
Yeah.
how do we create value? And then how do we quantify it? And then I'll take that and I'll put that in the
I just find
messaging.
like this conversation is super timely, because we'll be releasing this pod close to Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and just like, it is the epitome
Totally.
of price wars.
Yeah. Yeah. 60% off. I'm like scanning everything right now for that number.
Totally.
Yeah. This was a great pod, V. I enjoyed it. There's so many more questions I want to ask Herman. So, yeah, it was great to have him, and I learned so much. And I think there's like so much more to dig into on pricing, for not just for us,
Oh,
but for
totally.
probably
I
everybody out there.
definitely see him as a repeat repeat guest here for us. I think we have what's it called? I guess now we have the right person to kind of pepper these questions with, because he
Yeah.
commanded this authority, and just the way he spoke and answered our questions was just like so seamless and easy, effortless for him.
Mm. I guess that's what happens when you spend
That's a
a
fair
lifetime
point.
studying
That's a fair
price.
point. Yeah, it was good, man. So
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
All right,
Have a
V.
good
Until
one.
next time.
Adieu.
Adieu.